Yes.
Okay. And we're live.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm only going to introduce Josh and let him introduce everyone else. But most of you know Josh. He is our town selectman, farmer,
No,
filmmaker.
I'm no longer a farmer.
Oh, gave up farming. Filmmaker, drone operator, and so many other things. And so anyway, here's Josh. Oh wait, 2 weeks from now, Scott Cannon, acoustic jazz guitar, apparently very entertaining. 2 weeks from tonight, 7 o'clock, be here. Josh Gerritsen.
All right, thank you. I'm Josh Gerritsen, as Elizabeth said. I am going to give a short history on food sovereignty in Maine. And then I'm going to turn it over to these two people, Heather Rethberg and Eric Rector. And then afterwards, we'll open it up for questions and comments. So I want to first start this by asking a question. How many of you have purchased or sold prepared foods that were not made in a licensed kitchen from your neighbor? Okay. So food sovereignty is basically doing what we all have done and making it legal in our community. So I'm going to start with the history. On December 21st, 2009, the Maine Department of Agriculture had held a hearing on new rules about poultry slaughter that they were implementing. 50 small farmers from across Maine went to the public hearing to protest the changes. They were informed by the department that they had to implement the rules or else lose federal funding for the state meat inspection program. A group of farmers and farm patrons from that public hearing came together and drafted what became the Local Food and Community Self-Governance Ordinance, or LFC-SGO. The LFC-SGO passed in 4 towns in Hancock County in the 2011 town meeting season: Blue Hill, Penobscot, Seguin, and Trenton. The model ordinance's preamble reads, "We, the people of the municipality, have the right to produce, process, sell, purchase, and consume local foods, thus promoting self-reliance, the preservation of family farms, and local food traditions. We recognize that family farms, sustainable agricultural practices, and food processing by individuals, families, and non-corporate entities offer stability to our rural way of life by enhancing the economic, environmental, and social wealth of our community. Behold that federal and state regulations impede local food production and constitute a usurpation of our citizens' right to food of their choice." Now I want to talk a little bit about Dan Brown, farmer in Blue Hill. Back in 2006, Dan Brown had contacted the state veterinarian to inquire about state law requirements with respect to the sale of raw unpasteurized milk. At that time, the state veterinarian supervised the state's dairy inspection program under the Maine Department of Agriculture's Division of Animal Health and Industry. The state vet advised Brown that he did not need a license to sell raw milk so long as he did not advertise his sales. This position was consistent with that taken by a previous dairy inspector who had informed dairy farmers that the unsolicited sale of raw milk did not require a license or permit. After consulting with the state vet, Brown spent approximately $22,000 to improve his property, to produce and sell dairy products as well as food items such as canned vegetables. Brown then sold his raw milk and milk products directly to consumers without a milk distributor's license from a farm stand on his property and occasionally at local farmers markets. In 2009, the Department of Agriculture transferred regulation of the dairy industry from the state veterinarian to the Quality Assurance Division. After the change in authority, the Quality Assurance Division reviewed the statutes and rules under its authority and concluded that all persons who sell milk or milk products directly to consumers must be licensed as milk distributors, regardless of whether they actively advertise their products. Fast forward to 2011. Now this is after the food sovereignty ordinances had passed in those 4 towns. The Maine Department of Agriculture filed a suit against Dan Brown in a challenge to the food sovereignty ordinance, seeking an injunction against the farmer as well as fines for violations of the state food and dairy code. They alleged that he sold milk without a milk distributor's license, sold raw milk in containers that were not labeled and not pasteurized, and operated a food establishment selling dairy products without a license. Brown filed an answer and counterclaim in which he argued that the sign he posted at his farm stand substantially complied with the labeling requirements for raw milk, and that an ordinance passed by the town of Blue Hill in 2011 exempted him from state licensing requirements. He also contended that it would cost him $20,000 to comply with licensing requirements. Now, the Superior Court found summary judgment in favor of the state, stating that he conceded that he has sold and continues to sell raw milk without a license. The court reasoned that reading the local food ordinance as permitting Brown's unlicensed sale of milk would render the ordinance implicitly preempted, as it would clearly frustrate the purpose of existing state law. So basically, if a local ordinance is frustrating the purpose of an existing state law, then it's not, it can't stand.
Can I add one little quick?
Yes,
piece
please.
here?
And let me just say that Heather was literally in the fight of everything I'm talking about, so I hope I'm being somewhat accurate.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about that ruling, and it is a little into the weeds, but the way that the court decided to actually not rule on the ordinance was by determining that it wasn't clear in the local ordinance that milk was a food. So in order to understand it under the law, they had to say milk isn't a food. We define food in the ordinance as any product originating from the soil or animal. So,
And that you chew.
right, only chewable.
Only chewable.
So anyways, just by way of saying, because the courts had to do some acrobatics to understand it in that kind of narrow way, to narrowly interpret.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Maine's home rule laws are cited for authority by the local food and community self-governance ordinance. And home rule is something that I didn't know much about until I started to learn more about food sovereignty. Maine's state constitution affords the inhabitants of any municipality the power to alter and amend their charters on all local matters. Thus, Maine is a home rule state and grants municipalities the power to exercise any constitutionally granted power or function not expressly or implicitly denied by the legislature. In addition to Maine's home rule provision outlined in the state constitution, the ordinance also found statutory authority by which Maine grants municipalities all powers necessary to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its residents, and also cites the statutory policy to encourage food self-sufficiency for the state. Maine recognizes that safety is in fact not the sole concern of agricultural regulation, as exemplified in its stated intent under Title VII of the Maine Revised Statutes, the title concerning agriculture and animals. It says, agriculture contributes substantially to the state's overall economy, is essential to the maintenance and strengthening of rural life and values, and necessary to the preservation of the health, safety, and welfare of all the people of this state. The survival of the family farm is of special concern to the people of the state, and the ability of the family farm to prosper while producing an abundance of high-quality food and fiber deserves a place of high priority in the determination of public policy. Fast forward to June of 2017, and Governor LePage signed into law an act to recognize local control regarding food systems, also known as the Maine Food Sovereignty Act. The bill passed the House with a supermajority and unanimously in the Senate. Representative Craig Hickman of Winthrop had proposed similar legislation 4 times in the past before handing it over to then Senate Minority Leader Troy Jackson, who's now the Senate President, who is the sponsor of the bill. Hickman said at the time, in 2013, my version of this bill received 49 votes in the House and failed the Senate by 1 vote. What a difference 4 years makes. Clearly, the food sovereignty movement on the ground, town by town, has percolated its way up to the legislature. However, the USDA notified the governor soon after that they were prepared to exercise federal control of all meat and poultry slaughter and processing in Maine unless this law was changed before it went into effect. The USDA argued that the state laws were not compliant with federal law for meat and poultry inspection and demanded that the law specifically exempt meat and poultry. In October of that year, the legislature amended the law to exempt meat and poultry, and it went into effect. Today, there are 48 municipalities in the state of Maine that have food sovereignty ordinances, and including our neighbors Hope and Appleton, and I think theirs passed in 2011 and 2012 or so.
That's right, Hope.
Hope is
It's
first.
just a lovely anecdote about Hope, and someone from Hope is here, or who helped in Hope. is that the very day that we heard that the state was suing a farmer with one cow, we also heard that Hope had passed the ordinance. So it was a nice way of, giving us that kind of light into the future that Hope was going forward despite the adversity.
And this year, there are, I believe, 46 towns and cities that are looking into passing food sovereignty ordinances. So with that, I will hand it over to Heather.
Okay. So my name is Heather Redberg. I'm a farmer, as Josh said, in Penobscot. We have a diversified grass-based livestock farm, so we sell raw milk from cows and goats. And we also raise pigs in season and broilers and laying hens. Like Dan, when we first started, we called the department to see what we needed to do in order to follow the rules, and we were told, quote, "The state does not need to know you. If you're selling from your farm and you're not advertising, we don't need to know you. There's no licensing, there's no inspection requirement." And so the way that we came into this was that my husband had been working for a dozen years, I guess it took us, before we felt like we could get to the starting point of farming. We've been farming for a little over 20 years, but then we'd always been farming while he was also carpentering to subsidize the farm and growing it in sync with the farm, so at some point he could make the leap, be at the farm full time. So we had just done that. He'd been 2 years on an island off the coast of Maine, and I was home with the 3 kids, all under 7 years old, building up both at the same time. And so he had just come home, the very first growing season, full-time farming. We made the leap, and an inspector came down the driveway. We'd been, that year we raised 1,000 meat chickens and processed them at our friend's USDA regulated but state inspected processing facility. And the same inspector that came to our farm to inspect our farm store was also at our neighbor's farm that had the poultry processing facility. And so he noticed my husband and my son were there processing birds as well, and then came to our farm to follow up and said, "Where are you processing your chickens?" And we said, "Well, down the road at our friend's farm." And he said, "That's actually not allowed, because they're not allowed to share facilities. Every farm has to have their own facility if you're going to legally sell chickens." And thankfully at the time we were really good friends with, he was no longer, but was then the director of Food for Maine's Future. And I said, "Bob, what's going on? Like, I just heard this 1,000-bird poultry exemption passed, so like, why is this even an issue?" And he didn't know. We called MOFGA. MOFGA didn't know. So a poultry exemption had just passed. MOFGA had been working with Representative Jeff McCabe to try to open up the farmers markets and restaurants to farmers that were raising chickens and could slaughter them on their own farms as long as it was 1,000 birds or less. So what happened in that process was my first entry into the whole legislative process. We didn't find out until the law had already passed, and then it was time to write the rules. The rules made a big difference, and the rules were out of the legislators' hands, right? Those get made by the Department of Agriculture Quality Assurance Regulation Division. So that's when we entered into this, and I said, "Look," to the inspector, like, "this law just passed, so we should be all good. Even if we can't butcher at our friend's facility, which is a lot nicer, we can still do it from our farm and sell directly to people who want to buy our chicken." And he said, "I don't know about that." And he disappeared into his car for about 3 hours talking to then state veterinarian Dr. Buffet. And when he came back, he said, "Our department is going to write the rules, and we intend to write them just like the USDA rules. So you're going to need a facility just like your friend." Well, we knew he had spent $40,000 in that facility. We also knew that our land couldn't support that number of chickens. It wouldn't be good for the land. It wouldn't be something that we could do, and the scale would never match what we were able to do with, our family. So that was the first kind of blow that, like, oh, wow, okay, so here's Phil. We need to get our full income from the farm now, and we could have just lost this whole big enterprise. So we stopped raising chickens, and by the following winter, we were having financial trouble. 2 weeks after the visit from the inspector with the poultry processing issue, he said, you know, I noticed that you were selling raw milk from your farm, and I just wanted to let you know the department is looking at that differently now too. And I said, well, how do you mean? And he said, well, I'll send you a letter, but basically this change happened. The Milk Inspection Services has moved from animal health into quality assurance and regulation. And now you're all going to be called, redefined as milk distributors, in which case there's a whole level of licensing that hadn't been required before. For us, that meant our farm had been abandoned for 40 years. So the house, well, it's called Quills End Farm. The house had been inhabited by porcupines. So first we had to evict the porcupines, end that era, move the house back off the road. And we didn't do it. I hear this building moved with 200 people. We were able to use a truck and some professional services, but the house moved. Everything on the farm moved. We imported a guest artist studio from Haystack on Deer Isle, cut it in half and drove it across the Deer Isle Bridge, so we have a chicken coop. The barn, as it were, at that point was a disassembled boat house that somebody else had, and disassembled that, brought it to the farm and constructed it. So we had, I think at the time this all happened, we had 3 dairy cows. It may have been 2 at that point. But we started with an earthen floor pole barn, right? And little by little added concrete in different places, and then added a shed, and then another shed, and then a barn around the barn. So now we have a much nicer place in the winter for milking cows. But at the time we had 3 cows, and the idea of having to build a poultry processing facility and all of these extra things that we would need for value adding to milk, because you know, pretty soon once you have 1 milk, somebody's coming down your driveway and saying, I noticed you have milk, can you sell it to me? So those 2 things happening in such close conjunction with each other, and the way that they had happened really raised a red flag for us. At that time in the country, there was a very aggressive push by the FDA to eliminate raw milk sales. And this was very much in concert with those things happening. And what was alarming to us wasn't, we got into it because of the scale appropriateness, right? Our scale of farming couldn't afford those facilities, not if we were gonna have our full-time living from the farm. But where the food sovereignty came in was really about the self-determination. Our work had become illegal overnight because the state had simply changed a definition. And that was the thing. There was no process of oversight. The Legislative Committee of Oversight, which has just as long a name as the agency that regulates it, the Joint Committee on Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, there was no public hearing. There was no people weighing in. It hadn't changed because there were any safety problems. It hadn't changed because the people were saying, we're not comfortable without regulations here. So once we knew that, we followed our inspector's advice when I said, what do we do with this whole poultry business? You know, this law passed, but the rules are going to be such that they won't make sense for us. He said, gather your people and go to Augusta. So I'd never been to Augusta. I never testified before a committee, and now we've met several times there. And I really didn't know who our people were to gather. But I wrote a letter to our customers, and our friend Bob St. Peter sent it through the channels of Food for Maine's Future. It went to permaculture networks, and people at Food and Medicine and Brewer could see the connection here, that this was really a global industrial regulatory corporate structure coming right down to us. And as we learned more, we didn't notice at the time, but the linkage between, well, I'll just say this, there was this little story when I came back from Augusta the first time. A friend of mine who, you know, we'd been pregnant with our children together, was watching our children during this time that I was in Augusta. And it was when I just learned, I said to Russell Libby at the time, like, did what I just hear mean that like what we have to say doesn't matter? because Dr. Buffet, the state vet at the time, said after 50 people, the week of Christmas was this slaughter hearing on poultry. After all these people had testified that these rules did not make sense for the scale of what people are doing, she said it doesn't matter because we must write rules that are equal to or stricter than the USDA rules. And when I said, so to Russell, does this not matter then? And he said, that's what they are saying. So it was a little bit of a awakening for me, and then I realized after doing all this research, the reason it didn't matter was because the USDA had a cooperative agreement that linked our state inspection with funding, and we would lose the funding and Maine's meat inspection program if they wrote rules that were what the people were asking them to write. So those two things together, being redefined out of a business and losing this other because of this structure that had nothing to do with what was happening. You know, I drove to my friend's house to pick up my children and was like, oh, this is so bizarre that in this little bitty town, we lived in Penobscot then, she lived in Brooksville, like that could all come in between this relationship that we have that doesn't need all of this. So Bob St. Peter had said, if this doesn't work at the State House, you can go to your local level. And I said, well, what does that mean? How do you do that? So, you know, we looked to Montville. At the time, Montville had passed a rights-based ordinance about GMOs. Later, we heard about ordinances, rights-based ordinances in the towns of Shapley and Newfield, where they had been able to assert their rights as a community to keep out Nestle that had already made deals with the select board to put in test drills. So the people organized and said, we actually have an inherent right of self-governance and you can't take our water, essentially. I'm distilling. Yeah. So we had a template to use, and also at the same time, like I said, this was happening all around the country. The state of Wyoming and the state of Florida were both considering food freedom legislation. Also a term I'd never heard before. But essentially saying that anytime a product originates in the soil and it's just being, you know, from this hand to this hand, me to thee transactions, as Jesse elegantly calls it, those are not transactions where we need help making those decisions.
Yep.
And so the ordinance was not just written by farmers looking to not have to follow regulations. The ordinance was written by farmers and eaters saying, we have this relationship in our community that we want to protect. We want all of those relationships that come along with this food exchange, all these traditional foodways, we ended up calling it, to be protected. We don't want our farmers to have to be off radar, sneaking around as if they're not doing something noble or dignified or a livelihood. They shouldn't have to pretend that they're not raising food for us. So it was written by people together and based in the Home Rule Statute that says that any time a town passes an ordinance, it shall be liberally construed to effect its purposes. And there's a rebuttable presumption that the ordinances shall be considered valid. So that was our start. We can go from there in a number of different directions. There were 4 neighboring towns, my town, Penobscot. Sedgwick was the first one everybody heard about because Sedgwick has their town meeting first. And then ours was a few days later, and Brooksville, we always had the same night as Brooksville. Last night was our town meeting. And Blue Hill was then in a month later. So those first 4 towns, 3 adopted right away, and then it kind of jumped over to Trenton. And I can't tell you the rest is history because every step has been a hard one, and every step more people have been paying attention, and it's been more resonant with more experiences. And I will say, like, being in Lincolnville is really a special thing and cool to be here, because in all of these towns we have a lot of things in common in terms of, you know, we don't want our select boards, we don't want our towns to have to spend money on ordinances. We don't want our towns to be liable. So we have a lot of the same concerns, but it's really very moving to see how this ordinance has spoken to so many people in a way that impacts those relationships that we have right in our community. And it, like Josh said, it's now spread to 48 towns. there are only a little over 500 towns in the state of Maine. So 1/10, 10% of the towns in Maine have done this already, and another 10% are considering. And you know, there were only 20 towns that had adopted this when the Maine Food Sovereignty Act passed last year. So since then, another 28, including 3 cities, have adopted it. So it really took away that threat of state preemption that the first 20 of us who did this had to navigate. So I'll stop there, I think.
Thank you, Heather.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Heather?
You're welcome.
My name is Eric Rector, and I am a licensed cheesemaker. I live in the town of Monroe, and my cheese business is called the Monroe Cheese Studio. I sell at the Belfast Co-op right now. I had been selling at the Belfast Farmers Market. And I got started making cheese because I had my first cow, and she was pregnant, and when she had her calf, I thought I'd figure out what this whole dairy thing is. Had never made cheese before, really had never milked a cow before, and wanted to find out, as we had after buying our homestead, and figure out how to prune apple trees, thanks to Bob, and figuring out how to plant a garden and harvest different things. The cow was the next thing, and we had already raised sheep and goats and things, so this is our step up and the first time we tried dairy. And I thought I was doing pretty well. I milked her once a day. I kept the calf on her the rest of the time. But after about 4 weeks, I like to say she fired me because I just wasn't doing it the right way. Cows have to let down in order for you to get a good amount of milk. And obviously, I was not making her feel comfortable. But in the meantime, in those 4 weeks, I started making cheese. And really enjoyed that process, really enjoyed the magic of turning this liquid into this familiar solid food that is able to stay good through time and then transform itself over time into all the marvelous different things that cheese becomes. So that's how I got bitten by the cheese bug, and that was in 2003. And then in 2006, the Belfast Farmers Market came to me and said, we really want somebody who sells cow's milk cheese to come to the farmers market. They already had Appleton Creamery selling there, but they really wanted another cheesemaker who had a different option. And so I looked into getting licensed. And I had a very different experience than Heather described. I called up the state, and they came out and looked at the room in the barn that I had. And they said I might want to do this or that, and I did this or that to change up things. I needed a hand washing sink, basically. That was the biggest change I needed to do. And so a couple $100 later, I was a licensed cheese facility in Monroe, the first one since the 1920s when the Monroe Cheese Factory went out of business. And that's a fascinating story in itself. Maine has this long history of cheese making that goes back to all the way back to the founding of the state, but commercially through cheese factories beginning in the 1870s, but that's a whole other story I won't get into. So I was in 2006 given a license to make cheese, and I've been doing that ever since. My license costs $25, and I get visited by the state inspector at least once a year to have my formal inspection. She also will take a water sample from my water supply twice a year, and then she'll also, or someone else from her department of quality assurance will come and take a sample of my cheese or yogurt, because I also make yogurt and sell that, and bring that to the state milk lab and test it for coliform count, because the rule is that you need to have less than 10 parts per million, I think, coliform count in order to stay licensed, coliform isn't a dangerous bacteria, but it indicates that there's some place in your process that bacteria that you do not intend to be on your food are getting into your processed food. So what it is a really good indication that something I'm doing is not working anymore, because in general I have coliform counts below 0, but once in a while I will have one that's above 10. And what happens then is not that the state descends on me and immediately shuts me down and pulls all my product out of the store. what happens is I get an email that lets me know that I had a high count and that they'll be back to test again in a week or two, and hopefully I've done something or figured it out, and that will be low. And if I get another test that's above 0, they again don't descend on me and try to shut me down. They actually come out and try to help me figure out what's going on and how to get my tests back down to 0, because that will indicate just I have a good process. Now those 10 tests that I get every year on my product would cost me over $35 to get done for myself, just to let me know if my process is doing well. And there's many things that can go wrong during the process of taking the milk from the liquid state into turning it into curds and stirring the curds, draining the curds, putting them in the forms, and all that. So there are many different points at which there might be a problem, and in general 95% of my tests have come back at 0, so I know my process is good. But once in a while there's a crack in a bucket, or something that I hadn't noticed before, then I'll get a bad test and I have to completely reanalyze my process. That is incredibly helpful, and it's really, it assures me that I know that I'm making the best food I can for whoever decides to buy that. So at $35 at least a test, if I was doing it on my own, plus 2 water tests, which were also at least $35, then that's $420 of value that I've gotten for a $25 license fee that I pay to the Department of Quality Assurance. And to me, that's like an incredibly great deal. And the other great deal is that my inspector really is on my side. She wants to keep me in business and not put me out of business, and that the Maine Milk Lab especially is very interested in doing whatever they can do to help me make sure that my process is as integral as possible. And I really appreciate that. So the experience I've just heard, I do not raise meat for sale, so I can't speak to the chicken aspect of that. But as far as dairy goes, I think we in Maine are incredibly lucky to have such a positive and proactive state agricultural department that really focuses on the little person and the little farm. Now, I heard in the preamble that Josh just read in the Food Sovereignty Act that the act is necessary so that small farmers can do what they need to do and aren't forced out of business in some way. But that preamble, I think he said, was written in 2009. There were about 30 licensed cheesemakers in 2009. In 2017, there were 90 licensed cheesemakers here in the state of Maine, and that's more than there are in the state of Vermont, in the state of Wisconsin, in the state of California. So if food regulation is a detriment to the growth of the small farmer, and I can assure you that of all those 90 licensed cheesemakers in 2017, 88 were 2 people or less operations. Then I don't see where the food regulation is actually deterring the growth of value-added dairy here in the state. And again, I can't speak to the meat licensing aspect, but I see the actions of the Department of Agriculture very much on the side of me as a small business person and a small farmer. And I am a single person making as much cheese I can during the time I have to make it and selling it wherever I can. And I'm not ever told by the inspector I need to get bigger or I'm too much of a bother. I mean, quite the contrary. Actually, they're incredibly stressed at the Maine Milk Lab, and the 3 inspectors we have, which had been 2 actually during our growth period, but we finally got our 3rd inspector back. They're on the road all the time. They're visiting all these different folks 10 times a year to pick up these samples and offer their services and try to help us be the best cheesemakers we can. They're doing it without telling us that we're some kind of bother to them, but instead they're saying, how can I help you? And we're also lucky here in Maine because we have a cooperative Department of Cooperative Extension that is ready, able, and willing to jump in and help anybody who's interested, whether they're a licensed cheesemaker or just a home cheesemaker. It's amazing the services that are offered by the Department of Cooperative Extension, and I'm a member of the Maine Cheese Guild, and we've worked with the Department of Cooperative, well, not Department, the Cooperative Extension Services, to offer workshops for cheesemakers, home cheesemakers, as well as commercial cheesemakers, from the basics of dairy sanitation all the way up to advanced methods of making bries or blue cheeses or wash rind cheeses. And we brought instructors from France, from Scotland, from Canada, and from across the United States here to the state of Maine to help this industry grow. And we've been supported in doing that by the state and by the university's cooperative extension folks. I think, you know, we have this really good thing going here in the state of Maine, and I hate to hear that the regulators who are helping me stay in business and helping me make the best product I can for my customers are actually negative for small farmers. I don't see that in my experience. And I know many small vegetable farmers, and I don't hear the same stories that I just heard from Heather, from small vegetable farmers who want to sell at the local farmers market, who want to sell to their neighbors or sell on a commercial level. She mentioned that informal, or Heather mentioned the informal aspect where, you know, if you don't show out up in public, you can sell your raw milk.
That's pre
Right,
change.
that was before the aspect, and I don't completely understand either what went on in the state government that made them shift to that,
I do,
the
they've
more
told me.
aggressive, okay.
They've told me.
But that was not because it was always okay to sell it that way. It was because they didn't consider that a commercial operation until you hung out a sign and were open for business and wanted to put your raw milk into a store. You certainly couldn't put your raw milk into a store under that informal agreement.
No, and just to be clear, what Eric is talking about is not covered under the ordinance. So you don't milk your own cow, right? You buy milk in.
I buy my
cheese.
milk, yeah.
So he buys milk in.
She fired me, the
And-
cow did.
Right, so you lost your job milking.
Lost my job milking.
So he buys milk in from another farm,
Yep.
makes cheese and sells it into stores. Nothing about that is covered under the local food and community self-governance ordinance. That ordinance is only for where you're exchanging food between individuals, not in stores. And you also can't buy in,
I do
Product
exchange
from-
with individuals.
well, I'm just saying that it's not, that's, what you're doing is not covered by the ordinance, by the local food ordinance.
I mean, I
You
do
couldn't
sell
do
to the
what you're doing.
co-op, but I do sell at the farmer, or have sold at the farmer's market,
Right.
and I do sell to my neighbors.
Right, under regular state regulations, I'm saying
Well,
that
yes,
that's
I'm a
fine.
licensed cheesemaker.
I just want everyone to be aware that what he's talking about is not the same level of what we're talking about with the local food ordinance. So you
Level
do
meaning
need,
I'm a single person
meaning
making
that you
cheese.
do need licensure to do that. The ordinance doesn't exempt anyone doing what you're doing from a license
sure.
or inspection.
Okay.
So what I'm doing is very different than what he's doing. And just to be clear, I've never had an unpleasant experience with an inspector. And nothing, I hope, about what I said sounds that way. What we came up against was a system that was structurally, in my mind, faulty, because we had been defined out of existence. So when that happened, when the change happened of this definition, in subsequent years, of course, we sat in many public hearings in the state capitol. I think he's left the department now too, but he was the most recent acting director of the Quality Assurance and Regulation Division. And he'd been with this whole situation since the beginning, when farmers could sell from their farm without a license up until the Maine Food Sovereignty Act passed. We developed great respect amongst each other. We check in with what's happening with our kids in college and these sorts of things. So when the Maine Food Sovereignty Act, I was sitting next to the acting director of Quality Assurance and Regulation Division. This was in the amendment process. Everybody had been there for way too long. The committee passed the amendment unanimously. Everybody in the room applauded, whether they were for it or against it, because the process had been so good. I think that's why people applauded. I don't know exactly why they applauded, but Steve reached over and shook my hand and said, "Congratulations, you did it." So he is one who, and I can't remember if it was a bill on raw milk or if it was the food sovereignty legislation or food freedom. But at one point, he pulled me out into the hall and he said, this is why it changed. It changed because it moved from one division to the other. When Milk Inspection Services switched from animal health, which is where a number of people in that agency wanted it to stay, the state vet at the time was Don Honig, and he said, if you switch this, you are going to kick up a hornet's nest. You can't make everybody who's doing this legally illegal overnight. Phase it in for 2 to 3 years. But they didn't. They switched it overnight to Quality Assurance and Regulation Division. And what Steve told me at that time, the Attorney General's office asked them to review that policy. So there wasn't a statute to govern the policy. The policy was that we could sell directly from our farms, not in stores or anywhere else, but directly from our farms. And there wasn't a statute to go with it. So when they moved it from one division to the other, they said, well, instead of creating a statute that would have made sense for our economic tier of farming and for that direct exchange, they just classified us as milk distributors because it was the easiest thing to do and they didn't think anyone would notice. So Steve was very sympathetic about all of this because it wasn't a problem with individual regulators or that they were the big bad guys coming to shut us down. It was that the system was requiring them to do things that didn't make sense. And there are people in 48 towns for whom this isn't working. And that want that direct exchange to stay unfiltered. So
It makes sense for a record number of raw milk, licensed raw milk producers who do sell in stores. It
just sell in stores.
It makes sense
sure.
for a whole lot of cheesemakers who are very small and operate, some of which operate on a small scale, where I'm only selling into Belfast as well.
Right, and that does make sense. If you're going up to the tier of selling in stores, you know, you lose that direct accountability, right?
And in farmers markets and directly to individuals.
Right, but I'm just saying that the ordinance is only about that direct exchange. So it's not going into stores.
Not into farmers markets?
It depends on the ordinance and depends on what the people in the town decide to do. So that's what these ordinances have been about, is putting it to the people who are eating the food, putting it to the people who are growing the food and saying, what kind of food system do we want together? And that's where this ordinance came from. So it's people in your town deciding together, how do you want this to go? The town residents are the legislative body of the town. We've all worked with our select boards to enact these ordinances. And,
No, I have city councilors. Depends what city or town you live in.
or if you're
Not
on a
that
city
as
council.
councilors, we don't get to do that.
That's right. So city
Inside
council
Rockland.
government is different. Jesse from Rockland is here and can talk about that a little bit too. But that's the general idea.
Eric, is there anything else you want to add?
Well, I just wanted to follow up by, or conclude by saying there are many organizations here beyond the state who, and the Department of the Cooperative Extension Service that have been very helpful to small farmers, among them MOFGA, the Maine Farmland Trust, and then national organizations, especially in the dairy world, such as the American Cheese Society. And I believe we're all on, or I say we as a former board member of MOFGA, on the side of trying to make sure that individuals don't lose the ability to become farmers and to become producers for their neighbors and their communities. And that has always been the case for those organizations as long as they've been working on that. And the American Cheese Society is dealing directly with the FDA as it explores their concerns about raw milk. And I think Maine is in a special place because we are unusual in most states of the Union for never having outlawed raw milk at all. And we have an incredibly good record of raw milk sales and quality and not having any illnesses due to commercially available licensed raw milk. And that's something that a lot of other states, especially states with growing cheesemakers, is interested in doing. So there are many organizations that are working on this that do not look at the Food Sovereignty Act as the solution, but are offering other ways to support small farmers in being able to support them to feed their neighbors and communities.
Thank you. Okay, Vicky.
Yeah, thank you. It's, fascinating to hear the history of it and what you're doing. I wonder, Josh, you're working on this for Lincolnville, Marcy's working on it for Rockport, Allison's working on it for Camden. Are you guys collaborating? Is there one, is it similar ordinance that you're all putting together? Do you have a draft of that now for the?
So for Lincolnville, we haven't even started. It's just a conversation to begin with.
In Rockport, I started with the ordinance from the local food rules. I started there, and then the select board, town manager sent it to our legal team, who rewrote it from scratch, and that's what came back.
Where are we in Camden, Allison?
In Camden, I guess it's a combination of those things. I mean, definitely Josh and Marcy and I have talked, and Jenna and Heather, and now Jeremy our town planner, has been on the phone with people too. It's, at first we thought, oh, well, it'll be perfect if we can just decide what it should look like in one town, then we'll just copy that for the other towns. And then immediately it was like, oh, well, there are these concerns in Rockport that might not be the same concerns in Camden. And in Camden, we're trying also to not just have ordinances get passed that use totally different definitions than the rest of, the language, so that it's not so confusing. So it's so tempting just to take another ordinance that you see from a town and just replace the name. And the more involved I get with town government, I realize that doesn't always work, because we all define restaurant differently. And one thing we've talked about in Camden, it didn't start so much from the farmer perspective, because there just aren't as many farms, but the idea of just being able to sell soup to your neighbor. If I want to start making birthday cakes or something, just a little here on the side, and I want to sell it to my kid's friend's parent, that's a crime, I think, right now in some way. So just the loosening up a little bit from that perspective. We've talked about maybe the only addition we might make to the ordinance would be like signage or something saying, just at least alerting people, that these muffins were not baked in a commercially licensed kitchen or whatever, because I think people might deserve to know that.
Yeah, and I can just say, so the template, there's a template that we wrote in 2011, and then some state laws changed in 2013, and it was revised then. And then we worked with Representative Hickman after the Maine Food Sovereignty Act passed in 2017, and we're in 2019. So in 2018, I think it was like February, we finally finished the thing so that it would be aligned with the Maine Food Sovereignty Act. And it is a template which is meant to be tweaked and changed as it makes sense in individual communities, for sure.
Jesse, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just want to observe the tension here that is present in most of these discussions, and the tension is between sort of the process of self-governance and the practice of freedom, along with concerns about food safety and best practices that have been developed by scientists and experts to make sure that we follow these best practices to make sure that we're not poisoning our neighbors. And I guess I just want to point to that, number one, and also point that a lot of the tension and confusion around this thing hinges on the scale dependence of this ordinance and the scale dependence of this idea. And I can hear, it's like, okay, so what scale are we talking about? Because Eric's he's a one, maybe two people to your operation, so like, what does scale mean? Because he's not a big operator. And I guess I'm just thinking through this my own self, like, okay, what are we talking about when we're talking about scale? And it's kind of like, is it the scale of customer base depending on the market that you have access to? Because like, whereas Eric can sell to restaurants and stores and other distributors, the ordinance that Heather's describing does not allow for that. It's really direct face-to-face sales most often at the site of production and occasionally at farmers markets, depending on how the municipality defines it. But ultimately, I guess I also want to notice that I feel like we're all sort of chasing the same idea, which is, what does a resilient food system look like? Like, when we think about food systems, like, do we want, is a resilient food system the same as a completely fail-safe, always safe food system? I'm not sure that is the case. Like, for me, like, I'm after a resilient food system where it can survive some of the shocks that might occur in a national or a global distribution system of food. I want small-scale producers distributed throughout the landscape. To me, that's the picture of resilience. Is it the same as one that's completely risk-free? I mean, I doubt it, you know. And so I guess I feel like we're still. I feel like that's the thing. Even though there's tension, I feel like that's the thing that can still unify us. Is like, you know, keeping our focus on what does a resilient food system look like. I guess.
Right, I think that's so right on, because, you know, what Eric is describing is not something I'm opposed to.
No.
If and when we get to a point where we finally get the dedicated kitchen for cheese making and yogurt making, that would open up stores and restaurants to us, and licensing would be an option, right? So I think that there just needs to be as many options as available to get to that point of resilience, because we don't have enough farms. And great that the cheesemaking world is growing, but, you know, if a lot of the cheesemakers are buying from farms, we're going to need more farms. We're losing farms, and we have nowhere near made up the amount of farms that have been disappeared through policy. So we need to start changing policy to regain. You know, I mean, I just think we need to do that.
And
as
I don't want
many ways as we can.
to infer that by being tested that my cheese is 100% safe or always safe or risk-free. I mean, I think that any food has an inherent risk in it, if only that my cheese has milk in it, and some people are allergic to that. So that I never meant to say that the system under which I'm working and regulated is absolutely risk-free. It certainly carries some risk, as most activities we do. But I think what's important is that we have some basic tools available to us to increase the certainty that we are making good and safe food. Among those, testing our water supply. And I have had folks who are very much in favor of a Food Sovereignty Act coming into their town tell me they are not interested in testing their water supply. And that's where I start wondering, what is the purpose of a Food Sovereignty Act if there is no responsibility taken for at least assuring that what food I'm preparing, I'm doing in such a way that I understand my water source is safe. So that's not saying that just because you have safe water supply, you're going to make a 100% safe product. But if you don't have, or if you don't know what your water supply is like, are you sure you're making a safe product? And that's such a basic thing that seems to be off the table with regard to anything in the food sovereignty area. That's where I'm wondering, you know, what scale does it take to get a water test?
Well, I guess my initial response is that the food sovereignty ordinances are not prescriptive. They're not prescribing behavior.
No, but it also wouldn't require a food or a water test with regard to being a food producer.
You have face-to-face contact, so a person can ask. And I think the face-to-face contact it increases the traceability. So if one person does get sick, they know where they got the product. And that's why, you know, some of the stores is different.
And the other
traceability and the face-to-face, you can ask questions, you can make your own decision whether you think what they're doing is safe.
The other aspect of scale, when I've read food sovereignty ordinances, nothing in there, in the ones I've read, say that you couldn't open a store in a food sovereignty town and sell out of that store unlicensed goods.
Briar then Bob.
Hi, I'd like to take up a few minutes of your time. My name is Briar. I live in Lincolnville. I am a licensed dairy farmer, and I own the general store right down the street. 14 years ago, I bought my first cow. I was a homesteader, homeschooler, home birther. I have 5 children. I had very clear ideas and ideals about how I wanted to live my life and how we should all live our lives. As soon as my cow gave birth, I quickly realized that I had about 6 gallons a day of milk, and I was not prepared to make cheese, and I found myself with too much milk. So I tried a variation of ways to deal with the milk, from selling it to my local neighbors to having pigs, giving it to someone who was going to do something else with it, whether it was cheese or they had chickens or pigs. It wasn't until we got to Maine where I decided to look into licensure. We have had a variety of reasons to be concerned about liability, and so we wanted to do everything legally. It made the most sense. My first licensed dairy was in a tiny room in the back of my office next to my kitchen. Did not cost us a lot of money to put it together, and I didn't realize how much support was available to me for free until I called my state and asked for it. It can get a little confusing on the website, so it is really simple to pick up the phone and call, and almost always you have someone on the other end of the line, and if they aren't there immediately, they do respond pretty quickly. I have had 3 variations of dairy licensure. I had my first license in Maine, my second license in Vermont, and again back in Maine. When we moved back to Vermont years ago, I called the dairy inspector and asked them to consult with us, because I learned through mistakes that if I don't ask for help ahead of time, I end up making mistakes that cost money, and so she walked me through the process, and we do use glass bottles, and so in the state of Vermont, to do what I can do in my 1 room in Maine, I needed 4 rooms. I needed 1 room for washing, 1 room for processing, 1 room for cleaning, and 1 room for bottling if I used glass. This was in Vermont. Vermont has 3 tiers. The first tier does not require licensure or testing. I will tell you that the farms that do not abide by the regulations that the second tier or, industrial sized farms abide by are not necessarily the farms you want to get your milk from. I know this firsthand. I visited many of those farms. I know many of those people. I don't want to spend too much time talking about that, but we're talking about the only running water being a hose, no proper refrigeration, no bottle washing station, and we're talking about 4 cows selling milk to the public. 1 cow produces an awful lot of milk. I became obsessed with learning about raw milk laws throughout the US, and I was baffled by how many states made it illegal. So I have friends in Massachusetts that had to purchase it labeled for pet use only, and that's crazy to me. In the state of Maine, in my 1 licensed dairy, not only can I process my milk, clean my equipment, bottle my milk, but I can also have a licensed commercial kitchen. I have been through a number of regulations with a number of inspectors, from dairies to, the general store. We have 3 kitchens in the store. I have had a couple of times where my bacteria counts have been too high. One of them, I had too much coliform in my water. One of them, my total bacteria count was too high. Another, I had a somatic cell count that was too high. Somatic cell is white blood cell. That's pus. We don't really want to be drinking that. I never would have known that I was selling a product to my neighbors in Lincolnville. Many of you bought milk from me at the farmer's market years ago, and I was only selling it at the farmer's market. I never would have known that my well was contaminated, or that I was using quite simply the wrong dairy cleanser on my equipment. Had the state not called me and said, "Oh, your bacteria count is a little bit high, why don't we try to help you figure out what that means?" They came to my farm, a representative from the university came to my farm. We walked through every square inch of the facility, and the gentleman from the university said, "You're just using the wrong soap. You just need a different kind of soap." And it was like that. It was immediate. That was free. It costs me $25 for that license. Now I have a really nice dairy. When I started, I did not. It was a little tiny room in the back of my kitchen. I was super young and I needed a hand sink and a 3-bay sink. I also believed that I needed a bulk tank, which can be really expensive. As it turns out, I don't. I need a commercial type refrigerator that I bought from Josh Gerritsen. And as soon as I get my milk, as long as my cow has not fired me, by the way, I am still employed by my cow.
Congratulations.
Thank you. As soon as I get that milk into the fridge, my bacteria counts. I brought a sample of what that looks like if anybody wants to look at it. The other thing I wanted to just point out, because I feel like there's a little bit of misinformation that I am concerned about. I hear people talking about, oh, I can't bake bread, or oh, I can't, process my jam in my kitchen. You can in your home kitchen. I have a license right here. It's a $20 registration fee. There are some common sense exemptions, such as meat, such as dairy, such as the types of foods that might grow botulism. The only expectation is that... What?
I think vinegar is on that list.
Pickles, yeah. Many condiments are allowable. So you can baked goods, pastries, jams, jellies, fruit leathers, snacks, candies are all allowable for a $20 fee. Yes, they want to inspect you once a year. Yes, they want to make sure that your water is clean. No, they do not want you to have your cats on your counter like Farmer Brown did advertise that he had cats on his counter. That really bothered me. There is an article where Farmer Brown talks about how disappointed he was that his cats could no longer be a part of his milk process. I promise you. I did not have time to print it out, but it does exist. So no pets and no smoking. So I just want to make clear that for anybody who lives in the state of Maine that does want to sell to their neighbor or their friends, it's $20. The license is right here. It's wicked easy to get off of the internet, and you can call somebody and talk to them. When you're talking about the face-to-face contact, I really do have concerns about that because not everybody understands what it takes to make sure that milk is clean. And so, you and I might be great friends, and you might be like, hey, I'm so psyched I can get milk from you, and I could be lying to your face and you wouldn't know.
I would have no idea if you were licensed.
Right. And these are very, very common sense regulations that are incredibly inexpensive, and I have very real concerns. The state of Maine is incredibly progressive by allowing us to be able to do what we do with our very small single kitchen. If we are absolutely already existing in a resilient food system that supports small farms and local communities. And I am terrified that we will lose that if we do not recognize that what we have is the example that we really ought to set for the rest of the country. This is how it's done. Maine is doing it.
Resilient?
Yeah.
You said resilient?
Absolutely.
How do you define resilience?
How
How many calories does Maine produce for most of the members in the state? Because that's not resilient at all.
We are working towards that. We have incredible support from our elected officials. If we don't like them, we can vote them out. These are people that
Which
we
is
have
what Heather
elected.
did too.
Absolutely.
Participating in the democratic process.
so you
All I'm
know,
saying is
the amount of food that Maine imports right now, depending on if Mark Lapping, who worked with the Muskie Institute and has been part of the I can't remember the name of it, like the New England Food Plan with Amanda Beal and everybody else. The number varies, but we're talking about between 87 and 92% of Maine's food is imported. So we have a long ways to go before we're resilient.
absolutely. I did
So that's
just.
not resilience.
We're working towards resilience. Forgive me, I should have worded that differently. I just signed up for a program through the Department of Agriculture as a blueberry farm to sell blueberries at a lowered cost to schools. They have a program now where they really want to get involved with the schools and teach the kids that your community produces these commodities and this is how you can better support them. By feeding the kids, by taking the kids to the farms. I mean, I really feel like we need to recognize that our state is making strides towards supporting small farms and growing small farms and becoming more resilient. That's
And-
part of
This is.
I think that's part of the Maine
That's part of what we're
sovereignty.
doing. Yeah.
I understand.
And I agree, Brian. I mean, it sounds like from the both of you that there's, and that was one of the enlightening things to me about getting involved and going to the state and lobbying in favor of the Maine Food Sovereignty Act was that, you know what, the system as it exists is pretty elegant in a lot of ways. I hear what you're saying and I totally agree. And at the same time, this food sovereignty, these municipal ordinances is a question of freedom. Like, if other people want to operate outside of that system and they have a willing customer base, shouldn't they have the freedom to participate in that traditional food system? Because that's what we're talking about here, is codifying a traditional food system that all of our ancestors participated in.
Yes, but our
by the way.
ancestors also became aware of the fact that tuberculosis was transmitted through milk.
Okay, that just
That
sounds like
was
fear.
whiskey sludge that they
All
were
right,
mixing up
let's-
with the
This is true.
Let's
of
not all
course,
talk over
yes.
each other.
As you were.
I'm not going
You're the
to tell that,
facilitator,
but
man. Go ahead.
maybe.
All right,
I have a
Heather, did you?
question.
Yeah, if I could just share a few experiences to speak to it. So in terms of Maine being a shining example of food production, let me just say that I think we're all part of that, whether we're licensed or not. And it's only since 2009 that the department drew these lines of division between us. And that was something our representation in Augusta said, you know, don't do this. We're all part of the same food system if we're working on these kinds of areas of common ground. How we get there may be different. What we start with makes a big difference in terms of getting the piece of paper that costs $25. It makes a big difference. So some of the experiences that I can share, because it's, for some reason, people call me when they're thinking about passing this ordinance. So I haven't been to all 48 towns and the 3 cities that have passed this, but a number of people have shared with me what they're thinking, what they're doing. I know that the people are moving to the state of Maine because of these food sovereignty ordinances. They're moving across the state of Maine from one county to another so they can be in a town that supports farming so tangibly. And Greenwood is a great example of what Briar is talking about. There was a licensed baker, also in the town of Orland was a licensed baker. In Orland, the woman had a disability, so in order to maintain the kind of kitchen that she would need in order to have the license, she would have to produce to a certain amount of product on a continual basis, and she couldn't really do that with her disability. So in Orland, the ordinance allowed her to be able to bake out of her kitchen and do it in line with what her capabilities actually were. In Greenwood, it was sort of funny because it was a select board member who didn't realize that the ordinance would actually apply to her at all, but she had been a licensed baker out of her home kitchen for a number of years and had stopped because she couldn't do it as a full-time business to maintain that licensing. So she'd let the license go, and a number of people in town had been asking her, like, hello, can you bake again? She's like, no, I don't really want to go through all of that again. I don't really want to do that. But once they passed the ordinance, one of the people who's also a licensed, is she a baker? Suzanne is a baker?
Yeah, she bakes, yeah.
So she is somebody who holds a license as a licensed baker and also advocated for food sovereignty, because it's not so much about the licensing as it is about self-determination. And so she felt that was really important in her community. So after they passed the ordinance, she went and told the select board member, do you know, under this ordinance, you could actually bake out of your kitchen again? So everybody was happy. She had the skill, and I think that that's important to remember, is that, you know, you can put anybody in a facility with a triple base sink and all the stainless steel you want, but it doesn't mean that they're going to make a safe product. All of the education that Eric has referred to through Cooperative Extension, through the State Department of Agriculture, I've been to their dairy seminar, you don't have to have a license to get education. And you also don't have to have any education or demonstrate any kind of competency to have a license. You just have to be able to afford the architecture and the facilities.
You have to be able to prove that you don't have bacteria in your milk or in your water.
Well, not to get the license. To get the license, you have to have the facilities in place first, and you don't
But
even
to
get to square
maintain the
one.
license.
After you have a license, yes.
all right.
But you can't get there until you do.
Okay, we're gonna go in order of the hand, so Bob next, and then.
Okay, I'm Bob Sewell, I have Sewell's Orchard. I've been farming since 1978, so I do raw cider, cider vinegar, I have no problem with the way the state of Maine deals with the health issues. The problem that we have is that we can pass an ordinance here, and if it's not in sync with the state has jurisdiction. If the state's not in sync with the federal government has jurisdiction. That's where we really get a problem. Why would a farm that's never had a violation be inspected by the FDA? Why did I fall under the 2003 Bio Anti-Terrorism Act, which means they can search my home, my safes, all my property without a search warrant anytime they want, because I squeeze an apple. We're setting a precedent when we take governorship into our own hands at the local level. That's what Thomas Jefferson wanted in this country, for us to be able to say, this is what we want. Okay, why, you can't barter. If I make a jam and I want to trade it for a loaf of bread, I can't do that. I'm breaking a federal law. I mean, we don't know when the federal government will turn around and change how they're going to deal with the state. So if you have a food sovereignty in a small community, you can make it as safe as you want to make it, or you can make it as unhealthy as you want to make it. That's up to us. We can choose that. We'll have that freedom to do that ourselves. And if you have that state covered with that, federal government's not going to dare come here, because they do not want to be transparent. And that's what Jeffrey Smith, who wrote The Genetic Roulette, said to me. He said, they've been coming to the small farms in the Midwest for years now, and what they do is they come in, they threaten you, and they try to shut you down. There's been war against the small farms in this country since Ronald Reagan took office and put 25% of the family farms out of business in this country. We've been at war with the federal government as farmers. But we're not only farmers. MOFGA is farmers and gardeners. So you've got gardeners who want to do pickles, want to do this. Are they commercial? If they don't wholesale, they're not commercial. If they're not selling in the stores or any place, if they're selling it out in their front yard, that's a retail sale. I am, by the federal government, I cannot wholesale my cider because I fall under the juice laws, because they decided to take cider out of its own regulation and put it under juices. Whenever they want to change the picture, they change the pictures. So that means I cannot wholesale my cider. But if I retail, that's covered by the state. So as long as the state is working with me, as long as the federal government will let the state control retail, I'm okay. Until that changes, then I cannot sell the most unfriendly food to pathogens there is. E. coli, except for 157H, cannot survive in raw cider. My vinegar will kill it in your system. It will kill salmonella in your system. So I said to them, okay, so I can't wholesale my vinegar. They go, no, oh no, that's a food. We don't regulate foods, the state regulates foods. We're subjected to all of this. I think we can be as safe and careful and trust our neighbors or not trust our neighbors to grow and make and feed us what they want within our community. And I also believe, why can't our neighbors and Hope, why can't we set up liaisons with them? Why can't we become interconnected, you know?
So Bob,
Synapses that are firing together connect. You know, that's how your brain works. You know, once you connect it and you gain more power that way. As little individuals sitting here, we have no power. We have no power in this bigger picture. FDA came to me and said, you can't sell your cider because you don't pasteurize. Their law never said that. Their law, the way the FDA looks at food, is that you have to have a 5-log reduction in pathogens. Okay, Arctic krill, the most sterile place in the face of the earth, is a 3-log reduction in pathogens. So essentially, your food is irradiated. The federal government only sees safe food as dead food. And I believe in living food.
Thank you, Bob.
You have no amino acids once you irradiate food. You wipe that out. You wipe out the micronutrients. No wonder we're an unhealthy country. You know, we've been regulated into being unhealthy.
Did you want to respond?
No, that's okay.
Okay. Did you want to say something?
Well, Bob, I sell raw milk cheese, and I can sell it anywhere in the country under my licensing. So I believe my food is actually live, and it is regulated. And I'm as terrified as you of the FDA regulating my cheese, because I don't think they like my raw milk cheese. I agree with you. I think they prefer dead cheese because it's easier to regulate, not because they don't understand that you can have wonderful, safe, good raw milk cheese on a regular basis. There's a great book out about just that and how we're coming to understand all the scientific basis behind all the traditional methods we have made food for with 1,000 years of experience. But I'm afraid that the federal government will feel it necessary to come in if that map is turned over to
Yes.
food sovereignty.
I choose not to live in fear.
Well,
Well,
you just,
And living in fear gives them all the power. Why can't, democracy starts in our
I
community.
agree.
And I will say, just like, I mean, if you think about the arc of history, but also it's been our experience since we began this, right?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
And so when this was all getting going, back around 2007 and 8, when the FDA was really pressuring the states to change how they define us, at that time, there were a number of raids happening, and they were truly raids, where the FDA was showing up on dairy farms, particularly the Amish who exist outside of the regulatory structure. They were showing up very early in the morning, and they were shutting them down. And since then, since we've been doing this in Maine, you don't hear about those raids anymore. And I mean, I'm not just saying just because of what we're doing in Maine, but there was also a pushback across the country. Don't touch our food, right? If you don't do that,
Yeah.
there's nothing, there's no fence.
And Russell Libby, who is the executive director of MAFCA, was the one who went to Washington and set up the first watchdog groups against the FDA for food safety, because there weren't any. There was nobody looking at the bigger picture. And
Okay,
Russell Libby was one of the greatest guys to come out of the state of Maine. I worked with him for 14 years.
Thank you, Bob.
Hi, Bethany Alvaro, for the Lincolnville. So is the pushback against a local ordinance, is that based on your worry that you'll then lose the state support, or you just are worried about the food that we would then be buying? I guess I don't really understand if you can operate within, you know, your license, but the rest of us wanna operate with our neighbors. What is your concern for?
Will you be spending the money to get your water tested?
But that's up to the person that wants to buy my food. I
Is
mean,
it?
I think that if I'm gonna sell to my neighbor wants to buy from me, those are the decisions as adults that we don't need the state to come in and tell us, you know, to decide who you buy your food from. So that answers my question though.
Yeah.
Are you concerned about our health, or is there something that you will lose
Well,
other than?
health in the terms of assuring that there's just a fundamental responsibility behind creating safe food for your neighbors in your community. And I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that you know that your water is not contaminated before you begin processing and distributing food.
So then I can go to Hannaford and the co-op and buy those foods that I know have gone through that.
Or
That
to
option
me,
will always
at the
exist,
co-op,
but then
or at
this
the
will also
farmer's
give
market,
me-
or to my house, yeah.
Right, but then I can also have access to the
I think you're
products.
talking about very common sense things. I mean, I think you're talking, making sure the water's safe. I mean, I am
That's a
B&B,
fundamental
I am
thing.
B&B in Camden for 12 years, and we had to have, you know, our water, our dishwasher, the water had to be a certain temperature, so we kill things. I mean, just common sense.
And again,
things
Heather
that-
says reaching that level of getting licensed and spending the money to get licensed, again, the license costs $25 and I spent the money to put in my hand washing sink, it cost me about $350 to do that. So it's not the
You have the wall
tenth.
to attach it to and the roof and the, and the gas, and water,
I did,
and the foundation.
but anyway,
Helps to have that attached at $350 if you.
the license then costs me $25 and I get 2 water tests a year out of that, which would cost $70 on top of then the product testing that I know then my product is not being contaminated by any other mistakes I might be making or any other issues I might be having in my process.
But if you're not buying and selling to your neighbor, then why do you care if we do? I guess that's what I'm just really struggling to understand.
I don't understand that. Why, I'm selling my cheese to my neighbors and to my community.
Right, and you're choosing to work within the license frame, which is great, and that's your prerogative. I guess I don't understand the pushback on having both options.
I guess we won't understand each other.
Okay, Marcy?
Well, I wanted to follow up on that water quality issue because safe drinking water is a huge issue in Maine and testing wells is a really important thing. So in Rockport, we're doing this in conjunction with free well water testing. And so my question, when you say a $35 test, what exactly are they testing? Chloroform, arsenic, radon, do you know?
Just chloroform and nitrates.
See, okay, so it's just those, so they're not even testing the biggies like the arsenic and the radon, which are
Right, not
more-
for the license. I mean, obviously you can do that, you can get the extended
Right,
test.
and the
for-
uranium.
yeah.
So that was kind of my one comment there because that's part of what we're doing. Actually, the well water testing was the first thing that we did, and now we're looking at
Great.
this food sovereignty, which I think is important for all the municipalities and towns to look at. Safe drinking water, especially for our kids, having 3 young kids myself, is really, really an important issue, as well as food sovereignty. So let's talk numbers. How many people have poisoned their neighbors since this has been passed?
I can
I
tell
don't
you
know.
that
I don't know. I'm
spoke
just asking.
to the inspectors in Vermont, and I asked that question exactly. And her response was, we absolutely have documented cases of salmonella and E. coli poisoning in the state of Vermont. And the reason that they did not push was because, like Maine, Vermonters are very concerned about their freedom, specifically when it comes to food and agriculture. So they were trying to find a way to work with the small farmers, and that's where the tier system started to come into place.
Okay, so Maine. How
So
many?
Maine, right.
How
And-
many in the 48?
So when we first started this, one of the first things we did was ask the CDC for numbers, and they only keep records 10 years prior. So there were no cases of any foodborne illness outbreaks that could be attributed to farms in Maine.
Okay.
But to be fair, most of foodborne illness outbreaks happen in restaurants, right? So, but there were none, and the first ordinance had started passing in 2011, so there is an 8-year track record, and there's not been any case of foodborne illness.
Okay, so say I poison my neighbor. What's the legal recourse?
Same as if you're licensed. So if there's a foodborne illness and you go to the hospital, the CDC will get called, and the CDC will try to identify vectors. And they'll say, were you eating unwashed vegetables? Did you swim in a pond with bacteria? What are all the things where this could have come from? And they'll pinpoint it, and it has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you have a license.
Okay, let's, I want to hear from people I haven't heard from, so Jane.
Thank you. Jane Lipke, I own Bayleaf Cottages, and I'm actually here on behalf of the Lincolnville Business Group, who sponsors an annual event called Pickles, Preserves, and Pies. And the reason I'm sharing a story with you is it sort of speaks to this issue of selling food to our neighbors. Because every October we invite our neighbors to come and sell their pickles, preserves, and pies at this event, and people from all along the coast come and buy those things from our neighbors. And so my concern has always been food safety. Like, how do I know that the people who show up have food that's not gonna poison somebody who comes to buy it? And I didn't realize how much a concern that was going to be until the very first year we had the event. And Hannah will tell you that we have every June a pickling, preserving, and fermenting class that we offer at the community center for $20. So there's no excuse in this town not to know how to pickle something, really. I'm serious, like if you can't spend $20 to pickle properly, if someone might come from the Maine Extension Service and do this class for us, it's perfect. So, in the first year, this lady came with her jam to sell, and she says to me on the side, with the Maine Extension Service person right there with me, she says, you know, my relatives and friends keep complaining to me about my jam, that when they open the jar, it's got mold on the top of it. And Kate and I looked at one another, so we said to her quite politely, so how are you processing your jam? And she says, I cook the jam and I put it in the jars and I stick it on the shelf. No. She didn't process it, she didn't put paraffin in it, she didn't do any of the normally accepted things that you would do to process. But how would we know that as a neighbor? How would we know that as somebody going to an event like that and buying somebody's stuff off the table? She thought she was doing it right. So we said to her, we're trying to be really polite, because you know, I'm gonna pull all this off of the table and not let her sell it, right? And I'm gonna have to, she still doesn't talk to me to this. I did, I pulled it off the table, as soon as she told me what she did, I couldn't let anybody sell that. So we got thinking about this, and we realized that, and she said, you know, I make it just like my grandmother did. This is what my grandmother did. But her grandmother had a cellar, and her grandmother had a breezeway, and her grandmother made this jelly in the fall when it was cool. And she put it in temperatures that were acceptable to keep the mold from growing. And we don't live that way anymore. We live with heat. We don't live with 3 bundles of sweaters on most of the year. This time of year we do, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So times have changed. And so I can hear both of your points, and I'm here to support food sovereignty. I think we should do it. But I think there's nothing wrong with some testing. Or some knowledge or some experience. For example, I have a restaurant and I have to be ServSafe certified in order to have that restaurant. I am happy to teach people those rules and regulations without you having to go to a $100 class to learn that. You know, give me 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon and you'll know what you need to know. But we can't be making food without the knowledge of those things, whether it's proper procedures or practices. You can't be doing it by the school of hard knocks, or the school of I'm going to poison my neighbor. So what if on that day that woman hadn't asked me that question, and I let people buy that, and they went home and got sick? That to me is the big ultimate question. I think this is a great movement. I think we should be selling to our neighbors. I want this, want this, want this. I'm the person who wants to buy pickles. That's why I have the event. Truly. But let's think about what is reasonable and prudent, so that we're not putting ourselves, we don't want to be Lincolnville known for the town that has botulism. You know, we want to be Lincolnville known for the town that has the best stuff that you can go and buy from your neighbors, right?
And so you just asked her how she made it, and you learned how she done it then, eh?
Yeah.
It was that simple?
It was that simple.
That's amazing, everybody can do that.
No, what did you do? Yeah, but not everybody knows how it should be done. The consumer doesn't always know. If I'm buying pickles, I know how pickles are made. So my point is, I can understand the need for some level of regulation and water testing. I don't have radon or bacteria in my water, but my neighbors do down the street. And so this is a town where our water is all different. So little levels of testing, little levels of requirements are not big regulations. It's just us educating each other and helping us have the best products that we can have.
Thank you, Jane. Will, I saw your hand up.
There was somebody over here, I think, before me, Dave, who wanted to have me.
All right, Bonnie, and then Minnie.
Yeah, I just like to kind of take a look at this as just an eater, because I don't produce food. I do have some cookies that I made for a meeting last night that I brought what's left, and if anybody is willing to try them. You can do that, you know, but I've never tried making anything to sell or anything like that. But I moved up here over 15 years ago now from Baltimore, and there was a big supermarket right on my way home from work, and that's where I bought all my food. And I got to Maine after I retired, and I just kind of went, wow, I don't have to live this way anymore, the way I lived in Baltimore. And after a few years here, I met Heather, and I started buying from their farm. And one of the reasons I knew that I could buy from Heather's farm is that if you ever meet her children, you will be totally amazed. They are not only the healthiest looking kids I've ever seen, but they're smart, they're wonderful. And I'm going, okay, they eat the food from the farm every day of their lives. And why should I worry about that Heather's not producing really great food? Or, I buy their milk and yogurt and cheeses. I buy all of my pork there. I buy a lot of my beef. They don't sell as much as they used to for various reasons. I buy their chickens, I buy their eggs, I buy, all of it. And I've never had a single problem. One of the huge advantages of living the way that we can live in this state are the kinds of relationships that you can build through this. And Heather and I became really, really good friends. And one day, we spent a lot of time in Augusta for a while. And so one day, I had stopped to pick Heather up, and we were going to go to Augusta. And Phil said, her husband said to me, he said, you're spending a lot of money taking your dog to a doggy daycare place when you guys go to Augusta. Why don't you just leave your dog with us? And I said, oh, Phil, I don't know if that would work. I said, she'd chase your chickens. And he just kind of shrugged, and he said, well, she wouldn't catch them. And so the next time we were going to go to Augusta, I left my dog with them. She loved being on the farm. I think she would have preferred being on the farm to live with me, but and they loved her. And I went to Spain 3 or 4 years ago for 4 weeks. They kept my dog for a whole month while I was gone. Try that with your local supermarket,
Our supermarket does have a doggy wash.
Well, that's true. They do have a doggy wash station, but and it's just, you just know. You can in fact judge what's happening. You can do what you want to do, and this is what I like about the ordinance. Nobody's making me do anything, but I love living this way, and I don't know what the problem is, and as somebody had already mentioned, the pushback from the licensed farmers or cheesemakers is denying to the people that don't need to feel like they have to deal with a licensed farmer. It's denying us a whole lifestyle in a sense, and it's denying the survival of those farms. You say it's cheap and it's easy and it's really great, but we have lost hundreds of farms, small farms in this state over the years, and basically it's always because they can't afford to keep farming. As more and more regulations come down, they have to, they're required to do more and more different things. The milk farmers are having desperate times. It costs more for them to raise their milk cows and produce the milk, then they can't get it when they take it to the market. And you can't make a life that way. And my dad grew up on a farm for generations. His family lived a good life on the farm. And these days on small farms, it's a struggle. It's a real struggle. And there's no reason to make it more restrictive or more difficult for people to be able to, make a decent living on a farm. And
Which I and my cheesemakers in the guild do make a decent living, and we've been growing in this state. We haven't been shrinking in the state. Yes, the dairy farms
fine,
have an issue.
But that is your experience. I'm also
But you
really
denied my
curious.
experience. You said I'm trying to, that the small farmer is not allowed to flourish here in Maine, but it absolutely has.
Some of them aren't. And
But some of them are.
I have a question to ask you, actually.
And I have a question to ask you.
Because I have been told that you came to Maine
Yes.
from a really well-paying job, and that you have money that doesn't come from your farming.
It's true. I don't only farm. I in the proud Maine tradition of doing many different things, I don't depend on my own small cheese-making business to make all of my money. But there are cheesemakers that are not as small as me, but two-person operations, one-person operations, who do make all their money
And
making.
that's great.
Yes, and
that's
they've
great.
been
And I'm
growing
happy
in
for
this
all of
state.
you, but why are you trying to make it that
Not-
everybody has to do that?
I'm not,
You're being against the ordinance.
All right,
And that's restricting my freedom, and it's restricting Heather's.
All right, I'm gonna move on to other people I haven't heard from. Yes.
Oh, I just wanted to mention about what you said about the state and the water testing, because I'm in the middle of finishing up building a house in Lincolnville, and I had to do my original water test for a new well, and you have to send it to Augusta to get it. They don't do it in Rockport anymore. It was $190 for
a full
a
test.
full test, everything, from soup to nuts. But
We had good water.
it was good water. The
Good.
dowsing worked.
Good job.
Yes.
Yes, so I came to this not knowing a thing about the issue, I just came to learn. And I think I agree with what Jane said. I want to support farmers like Heather very much, but testing is important. And let me just say one thing. Suppose there's chloroform in your water and you don't know it, and after 15 years you get cancer. And you don't know if maybe that would have caused it. So it would be a hidden problem, and you would never know unless you tested it. So I think that's good for the health of everybody in the state, just to have tests like that. But support you fully so you can be doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Just test it.
I mean, just by way of, obviously there's a long trajectory to this, right? So in the very beginning and someplace in the middle and probably close to the end, when we were testifying before the committee in Augusta that was making rules or making the laws at this point, we said, what makes sense is education. There's no other license. If you're going to be a car mechanic, you don't have to build a 3-bay garage, or it has to do with your competency, right? And even then, it's going to be by word of mouth where you're going to place your trust, where you're going to accept risk. But we said, this is a fine way to proceed if you're going to want to know that your farmer is doing these things and you don't feel comfortable just having those conversations. So how about education, and how about water testing? And there was a raw milk bill that passed out of that committee that was fought against on all sides, and I don't think the Cheese Guild was speaking in favor of that at the time. But it got
Which
vetoed.
specific bill?
It was a raw milk bill that went through to allow direct sales, but required water testing.
The Cheese Guild actually
And-
introduced that bill, so I don't.
So then
I
that one you guys
appreciate
came on board.
You're
Okay.
telling me what my guild
I'm sorry,
had
my
been done.
mistake.
Yes, your mistake, but that's not you can't tell me that I'm denying your ability to farm by trying to convince you that the wisdom in the current regulations show that you can make a viable business by following the existing regulations.
So there were a number of raw milk bills, so my mistake not remembering which one they opposed and which one they supported. But that bill anyways didn't make it through. And I could, look it up to see. I can't remember if that's the one the governor vetoed or if that's the one that they attached appropriations to. But at any rate, we did try that at the state level. And eventually, after many different attempts and working with legislators, we came upon that what we need is the autonomy from the system to self-determine these things, like Bob was saying, at a community level. So I think tonight we've heard some really great examples of if these are concerns in our communities, we can address them in our communities. We can do water testing in the whole town. We can offer cooperative extension classes at our granges, in our churches, in our community spaces, and we can address those things. You can certainly write them into these local ordinances and tweak them that way if that's what is important to the town residents.
But are you suggesting that now the municipality is responsible for testing the water that a business?
No, I'm just saying in Rockport, that's something that they decided to do. That's a solution that they came up with in
Every
Rockport.
home will have their water tested?
We put it out there and we marketed through the school first because we wanted to test wells with children. So we did free well water testing and offered it to all of our residents.
And of course, it changes over time. When we're talking about bacteria, my well has not consistently been contaminated. It happened one time.
And it's not a one-year program.
I'm just
Right.
saying,
Yeah,
I think that
and
this
it's awesome, and
the ordinances about these
It's just part of what
conversations can happen at a local level, and we can figure these things out in our towns, that's all.
Will, thank you, Josh. So I think what's more important is to sort of like take that big picture, at least strategic look at this. And I think it's important to remember that the motivations are clearly enunciated. We've heard them tonight. There's fear. The respect for the federal government is based in fear. It's based in a concept that we have a privilege that we're exercising in Maine. It was described as progressive, but it was corrected to government, and the corporations which pay for federal rules and laws to be passed have come to Maine and tried to implement rules on us. We've always resisted that. I mean, for example, if we went lockstep with the federal government, then we would have had the Real Animal ID Act back in the early aughts, and every single person that had a chicken in this state would have had to spend $60 buying an RFID chip and having it put into their chicken. And then they would have had to write a report up every time their chicken left their property and walked across the road. I mean, I'm not kidding you. This is exactly what the federal government wanted. So it's important for us to remember that these people have no right, the federal government, I'm talking about, those regulators, have no right to get on a high horse about safety standards. They're the very people who ensure that corporate beef is delivered every single hour to American citizens that is totally irradiated and totally contaminated.
We're not talking about federal regulators.
Right, well, no, but specifically, actually, we're talking about the effect of it. So the point is, it's about fear. So first of all, we don't need to respect the federal government because they clearly are not competent and they're not working for our best interests. They work for business interests. Right. We've already repudiated their right to regulate our lives here in Maine repeatedly. And that's why it's important for us to remember that it's about the self-determination which Ms. Redberg keeps referring to and Bob referred to. At the end of the day, we either have the confidence of our convictions and our neighbors, and we fundamentally believe in our communities. We take that responsibility and we accept that we're a member of a small community and that that's how we're going to actually understand it and work within it. Or we choose to believe that a nanny state has the right to come in and define our lives and in fact shut down our ability to buy our food from the people we choose. And I believe we're Mainers. We're traditionalists in this state. And I point out we already got about 50 towns that have done this. By the end of this year, we're going to have about another 50. I bet in another year and a half, we're going to have another 150 on top of that. We'll have about 50% of the state. So the whole point is, I understand that there's a lot of fear in the hearts of some people, but that doesn't mean that the rest of us have to take that fear on. Each and every one of us has a choice to make in this life. We're either going to accept the fear that somebody else wants to serve to us so they can watch us carry it away from them, or we're going to put our hands up and send it back where it came from and move forward without fear, with confidence that we know our community and our neighbors, and we are not afraid of them or what they will do to us. because we all live right here.
Thank you, Will. Anyone who hasn't spoken?
Just a quick thing. I wonder if part of the problem with this is it's very difficult to group all of these different foods in together. I mean, I've learned a lot about dairy tonight. For me, I am absolutely convinced that anybody that doesn't go through the state licensing process for dairy is making a very odd decision unless there's a lot that I don't know. And so I kind of think that education can work pretty quick. People are pretty good at figuring out these are the foods that I need to be concerned about, and this is the process. And so I think the word would spread pretty fast that for anybody that has a cow, hey, let me tell you about this awesome deal where you can get all this testing done for free and it works really well, and people would probably do that, and people would probably find out, oh, that milk down there, that's not licensed. What's wrong with that farmer that they've made this decision? They can't let go of their cat on the counter, and is that a risk I want to take? So I guess I feel like, I don't know, it's just hard to, for me, this was about being able to sell like soup to your neighbor, or being able to go over to my friend's house where I decide every day, okay, it's okay for my kids to eat there. If I want to be able to, my child really likes something, I could say, hey, can you make a bunch, I'll pay $20 to make a bunch more of those muffins, and can I buy it? Very hard to group that kind of thing in with dairy, and I mean, it seems like it's just it seems like we have an outstanding process with the dairy, but maybe it's hard to use that as a reason to not do some of the other things.
Do you want to respond to that?
Well, just that we've been milking cows for 10 years. Before that, we bought our milk from a farmer named Kendall. He'd been milking cows since he was 4, but he said he still didn't really know anything about cows. But we trusted that he actually did, and so I went, basically, I mean, my kids were weaned from me onto the milk that he was producing, and I trusted that he did know what he was doing, and that he could ensure the quality of his process. And so that's what my kids grew up on until we started milking cows about 10 years ago. And obviously, we've got a safe process, and for us, it doesn't start with stainless steel and with testing, but it goes into, like, we're really talking about soil, animal husbandry, and there's a holistic big picture of what is actually going to make both safe and high quality milk. So
right, and you knew enough to be able to evaluate that in a way that
there isn't anything about a state license that is a competency test. You're not learning, you don't have to pass an exam to demonstrate proficiency.
You don't have to know to boil the jars after.
No,
jam.
I mean, you're gonna, so like Briar and Eric are pointing out, you have these periodic visits with an inspector. But personally, I wouldn't rely on an annual visit with an inspector. I mean, even if you're having your milk tested in its ideal condition, the milk is being tested 1 out of 60 milkings.
But
Yeah, I
who's
don't see
ensuring,
I don't.
who's ensuring
have you
the
ever had
safety
your
and the
milk
quality?
tested in the 10 years
We
that you've been
have.
milking?
Right.
Are you
Right.
licensed?
Have you had your water tested?
Of course.
Well, and that's the thing, but the thing is that not being licensed doesn't mean we don't test,
I'm just saying that the
right,
quality-
though? Not being licensed doesn't mean you don't test. Like,
It doesn't, but what I'm trying to say is, and what you just said is something I wanted to respond to.
Oh, I said, just because an inspector comes doesn't mean I boil my jam, because she was talking about how somebody
Right, so
at home.
that's my point, is that the person who's producing the food is the one who's ensuring the quality all of the time. So I know Maine is a big state, but a small community. So I know the farmers that sell Erica's milk. Our cows our beef cows have been sold to the people he's transitioning his farm to, right? I mean, we're a small state. So one time I come back from Augusta, and it was either a raw milk bill or it might have been a food freedom bill, and Ann and Cecil from White's Orchard were in our driveway. And I was like, whoa, this is what just happened. And and told them some of what happened, and they just said, that's BS. We haven't had an inspector come to our farm for 8 months. And the last time she came, like, they had to educate the inspector. Jack Hill in Monroe, isn't he in Monroe?
Yeah.
Same thing. The inspector didn't know how to take a sample without getting a high bacterial count. So she didn't know you had to churn the milk first, you had to stir it. You can't just take it off the top or you're gonna give the farmer a high bacterial count. The next time she came, his bulk tank had just been emptied. So she went and took a sample from his refrigerator. He keeps it in an open pitcher in his refrigerator because that's how they drink their milk. So he got another high bacterial count. He said, don't come to my farm again until you know what you're doing. I mean, so I'm not saying this is ubiquitous, but I'm saying that there are different experiences that are real, that are happening, and it isn't the inspector that can ensure the quality and safety of the food. At least we need to be able to make these decisions in our own communities. And that's the point of these ordinances.
So what Heather's leading out in those examples that she gave us is that that was when the state was trying to save money by not sending dairy inspectors to pick up samples, but by sending restaurant and other inspectors who happened to be able to fit a dairy farm into their list. And after a year, they realized that was not going to work, and they hired the third inspector who would then be the one to pick up. All milk pickups for samples would be done by actual inspectors. And yes, the dairy inspectors can't get to every single farm as often as they would like to, but they make an effort and they do get to us, and they only have to inspect us once a year. So even if they get to us 8 months late, it's still within the parameters. So it's interesting. I didn't come here trying to spread fear. I thought I was trying to give you my experience of being a regulated, very small farmer, and I'm just seeing the wisdom of what I get from the state and what I get from cooperative extension and all of that. And I don't understand why anybody who's selling a dairy product wouldn't want to take advantage of those resources that the state of Maine offers to anyone, and offers willingly, and is very, very concerned about being able to reach everyone with the information they need. Why is that a bad thing? I'm not trying to keep farmers from being farmers. I'm trying to help farmers be better farmers. And I see that help being extended by the state. I do not see people being pushed down when I see a growing cheese industry and a growing vegetable industry. We've now got a lowering age of our farmers here in Maine, which is totally different than the rest of the state, and that's because Maine is really interested in supporting small farms, and those small farms are coming here and growing.
Thank you, Eric. I want to get to Bob and then Vicki.
I just want to say, whenever you have any form of like water test, there's a certain level of illusion to the results of that water test. One, the state just lowered the chloroform levels. So a lot of people got their water tests kicked back this fall, because I talked to the regulators. I called up Augusta, and this was a big problem, because locally we now have to send the A&L laboratories, and they go, you know, safe levels, but you know, so much before. Before they didn't do that, and it's a $50 test now for a nitrate and chloroform test. So that's now, you have to send it back. That's now $100. So you don't get the second one for free, right? Because the state, you know, has changed. So the state can always change their regulations to fit what they want to fit. But okay, so I got my, let's say I test my water in my well when it's bone dry in August. There's no chance of any groundwater seeping in through that casing where it's 10 feet into ledge and weeping in. That's the only way you're gonna get chloroform in a drill.
Are we
Coliform, I always say it mixed. I'm just like, those words all sound.
Remember, Bob's an enlightened hillbilly, okay? He's one of our best, you know.
And I don't remember names either. There's a lot of problems, but anyway.
Hillbilly first.
So, but let's say you have a cow go uphill of your well and make a few messes there, and it rains steady for 3 days. And this happened in New York State at a fairground, and it contaminated every well on the fairground. There was multi-million-dollar lawsuits because those cows were fed antibiotics and they were fed corn, and the E. coli really upsets their stomach system, so the 157H flourished and it went into the water system and poisoned the people. This can happen. Any well is susceptible to groundwater contamination at any time. So you get that test when everything's perfect. 6 months later, you could have, high levels. So there's that issue. And the other issue, I believe that commercial cheese, dairy, all that should be inspected. I have no problem with that. Meat should be inspected. We used to slaughter cows, sheep, pigs right at the farm. We could have them, drop them in the back of a pickup truck on a piece of plastic, take it to the slaughterhouse that was licensed, and that was legal. I'm sure they probably changed that now because I haven't slaughtered animals in quite a while. I also want to say I bought my first piece of land when I had $250 in the bank. I did stonemasonry for 35 years to pay for my farm and built my farm nights and weekends. So I can't imagine a kid today having that opportunity. If somebody wants to grow something, if they want to get a little piece of land and do whatever they can on it, I'm all for it. I highly recommend, if you have a home, that you do test your water periodically. You do have radon tests. I mean, your health is the most important thing to you. I don't cook a piece of meat without soaking it in my vinegar first. Chicken, even fish, because I love the taste of my vinegar, and I know I don't get sick. I never get sick.
Thank you, Bob. Vicki.
Yeah, I'll just quickly echo what Bob is saying about the testing, because I sell real estate, and there are people who live with high levels of, let's say radon in the air or in the water, and they've been living with that, and it's a known carcinogen, and there's levels of up to like 33, when you're really only supposed to have 4, there'll be people with 33, or I've seen 60 in our area, so please do that, that's important. But I was gonna say, in addition to this maybe being about the different products and different for the products that are sold, it also seems to me to be about scale. And I think it's a little bit analogous, and maybe you'll agree with me back here with the lodging industry. Because, in Camden at least, we've got homestays, which is somebody can have a couple people, stay in rooms in a very minimal thing. B&Bs, up to lodging. As you get more and the scale gets bigger, then you've got the fire inspector coming in, then you've got the restaurant inspector coming in. Whereas, for the lower level, maybe a smaller type of operation, you don't have quite as much because you're not dealing with as much of the public and you're not maybe doing as many things. So there's something to that too, the size, I think.
All right, let's take one last question and then closing statements. Yes, Jeff.
Yep, I'd like to ask you as a selectman and also the select people from other towns here who are thinking about doing this, where do we go from here? This is obviously an interesting topic which has many different facets and deserves to be talked about a good deal more, but what particularly is the process of going from here to an ordinance or from here to no ordinance? And to what extent are various selectmen working on this and what needs to be done next? And in particular, would the three of you, as being from different towns, work together? And what is it that you expect from the people here or the other townspeople?
Well, I'll speak to what's happening currently on my board in Lincolnville. At our last Board of Selectmen meeting, we decided to reach out to our town attorney to get more information from her and then have a discussion. So that's where we are right now on a board level in Lincolnville.
And next steps, sorry.
What's it?
And what are your next steps?
And so after that conversation, I don't know, we just see what the board says. And
should people be going to this board meeting, or is there anything you would ask of people here to bring to the board, let me put it that way, if
I-
indeed that's where the next focus is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're
So,
gonna move from the library to the town office? is
right,
that
so,
it?
so hopefully this is on the March 25th agenda. And I encourage, if you have feelings about it, if you're for or against it, please come and speak to the board and tell us how you feel, because that's how we make the best decisions, because the public is a resource. And we can make a better informed decision if we hear from as many people from our town as possible.
Yeah, so I mean, there are two options basically to get anything on the ballot. Of course, there's all the discussion that happens before where you decide exactly what form of the ordinance would go forward, but you can either get 3 out of the 5, or at least 3 out of the 5 select board members, and that's the way it works for most of these towns around here, to vote to put it on and put it out to voters. Or if a majority of the select board doesn't want to do it, then you always have the option of a citizen's petition. You can get 10% of the voters that voted in the last gubernatorial election to sign something, and then unless you're asking for something illegal, there's pretty much an obligation that that would go on the ballot. In Camden, we're looking at trying to decide whether there would be enough time for the June ballot or not, or whether some of these things might be able to be decided in special town meetings too, where you just have a bunch of people come and vote like that. So that's sort of where we are in Camden.
And in Rockport, I have a meeting with the select board at their regularly scheduled meeting on Monday, March 11th, where they're going to review the ordinance and vote. Hopefully we get our 3 out of 5, hopefully get 5 out of 5. At which point we would set up a public hearing, and residents, we would love to have residents come and speak at that public hearing.
Is there anything to be said for the 3 towns to be working in conjunction with each other, or is that?
Well, I think we all are. I think that's why we're all here.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Sometimes
Alsborough
that
as well.
makes it easier, and sometimes it
It
makes
makes
it
it hard.
hard.
But we all have sounding boards.
You come to a Micro Solid Waste meeting if you want to see.
Yeah.
Ambulance meeting.
Yeah.
All right, so closing statements. If you have one.
Had thought of a closing statement, but it does occur to me that perhaps we didn't actually say, Josh read the preamble to the ordinance, but what the ordinance actually does. So if you want to look at the ordinance template that at least I think you've all taken to start with, it's at localfoodrules.org. It's called the ordinance template, Local Food and Community Self-Governance Ordinance of 2018. We did draft that, like I said, with Representative Hickman, who we work very closely with on the Maine Food Sovereignty Act. So it is aligned with the Maine Food Sovereignty Act. You can see what it does. It's about a lot more than raw milk. So that's an easy place to start. And of course, I'm available in Penobscot. I've been doing this for a long time, and there are 48 towns that have done it already, so it isn't as if it hasn't been vetted duly, and 28 of those towns have passed it since the Maine Food Sovereignty Act passed last year, so last town meeting cycle was really quite busy. But I wish you all a great community conversation about it, because it really can bring a community together when we decide how we want to exchange food amongst ourselves, and we can really build some true resilience that keeps us a little more secure from external forces.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really glad Josh invited me to be here, and I hoped to be able to just offer my experience as a very small cheesemaker selling commercially under the licensing here in Maine, and I wanted to let people know that Maine supports small farmers in many different ways, and I have the experience that I've had that has been very positive, so thanks for letting me talk to you guys.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.